So in this video, I'm going to be discussing the five major turning points in the history of the church. I'm going to specifically be talking about Gregory the Great in the 6th century. I'm also going to be talking about Charlemagne in the 9th century. I'm also going to be discussing the Crusades, specifically the First Crusade. I'm also going to be talking about the Great Schism in Avignon Papacy, and finally the Black Death. Um, the medieval church in the Middle Ages was a very significant um, presence in medieval society, and it really increased and decreased in its power, its authority, and there are so many different factors and turning points in history that affected the legitimacy and the power of the church. These five are the ones that I'm going to be specifically talking about as I focused on these ones mostly in class. And these are the ones that, in my opinion, affected the church to a higher degree. So the first major turning point that I'm going to discuss is Gregory the Great in the 6th century. So during the 6th century, Rome was in shambles. They had just had a big battle that left everything in society, socially, economically, specifically even the church, everything was in shambles. And Gregory the Great was this wealthy bishop of Rome, and he played a huge influential role in the recreation of the papacy. Before he emerged, Roman Christianity, like I said, was in shambles as Islam was coming and taking over parts of Europe. But Gregory founded 6 monasteries and he recreated an administration in Rome. These were known as the Papal States. And Gregory organized a militia, and he actually guaranteed food and water, and he created treaties to have peace, essentially to just have a safe place for people to live. They had just had this huge battle, and everyone was scared, and Rome was in shambles, and he used his wealth to give food and water to these people and create a safe place. The Papal States were ruled by the Pope, and the Pope, this would actually make the Pope a secular ruler and not just a spiritual one, which actually had a lot of significance because during this time, there wasn't really anyone in power and everything was just kind of unorganized. But Gregory actually wanted to remain loyal to the Byzantine emperor, and by paying for militia, food, and water, he created a more organized structure for Rome. Gregory also began to intervene in other churches' affairs, and when problems arose, he would make a legitimate and authoritative decision, which would make him, have some authority and some power. He also further sent missionaries from monasteries to England and other parts of Europe, and he converted them to Christianity. The presence of the monasteries that he created was influential because people would donate to them, and it increased their political entity. And he had legal reform, which helped to give life to Rome again. And Gregory was extremely significant because during this time of them being in shambles, no one really had faith in the church, and everyone began to kind of turn on them. But he emerged and he paid for all these different things, and he began to spread Christianity again and give power to the Pope again, making him a secular ruler and making decisions for other churches. He really helped to kind of turn it around and help kind of have the church emerge again. The second thing that I'm going to be talking about is Charlemagne and how his presence and his rule had a major effect on the church as well. He ruled during the 9th century and transformed society in Europe. He had extreme military tactics, and he was a really strong ruler, and he was able to take over many parts of Europe. In 751, there was a papal-Frankish alliance that formed while Charlemagne was kind of emerging, and he was the emperor of the Franks. Um, and with an economic decline in his kingdom and Christianity spreading throughout, he used his military tactics to expand his rule, and they doubled the size of the kingdom in just 40 years. He earned this reputation as a great warrior, and along the way, he actually converted people by the sword. And he would essentially say either you convert to Christianity or you die. Um, and he took this alliance that he made with Pope Leo, and he was crowned emperor of Rome, of the Romans. And there was the story that we had learned in class where Charlemagne had met with Leo and they were at this church and he was kneeling, praying, and Pope Leo came over and crowned him and made him the emperor of the Romans. And he had founded the Holy Roman Empire and he was the Holy Roman Emperor. And this was a title that hadn't been used in like 300 years. And he essentially reestablished the Roman Empire in Europe. And this was extremely significant as there was a combining of church and state. And this totally changed the entire relationship between the empire and the church. And he made it geographically focused in France. And he had a lot of scholars that he brought over, which led to this Renaissance. And it was extremely significant. He was one of the major rulers during this time. The second major turning point that I'm going to discuss is the Crusades in 1095, and this is specifically the First Crusade, where at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II calls upon the Christians to undertake a military expedition, and this was to support the Byzantine Empire against the Turks. And this would then lead to the conquest of Jerusalem 4 years later, and effort by Western Europeans to take over the Near East. And the Crusades played a huge role in the church as they were spreading their religion and their faith across all of Europe. And, the Crusades were extremely powerful and they were military driven, and they really helped to spread Christianity. And then the next major turning point that I'm going to discuss is the Great Schism, or the Avignon Papacy. So the Avignon Papacy refers to the time period between 1309 through 1377. And this is where Pope Clement V moved the papacy and resided for more than 60 years in France. And he moved the papacy to France because of the conflict from the previous pope and King Philip. This Avignon papacy resulted because of the conflict between the two, and the tensions were extremely high. And the way that the Avignon papacy was resolved was through the Council of Constance in 1417, where two popes, Gregory and John, were forced out, and a new pope was elected, Martin V. So this Avignon papacy and the Great Schism was huge. These are just kind of like the major things that happened during this time, but essentially what was going on was three popes began to take control of some territory in Europe, and there were three popes that were all ruling in different places. And the pope is supposed to be Christ's vicar on earth and one of the most powerful people in the church. And when there's three of them, it makes it extremely hard to view the church as legitimate. And so during this time period, when you have three popes and the papacy's moving to France and there's all these tensions, the church loses a lot of credibility, and it loses a lot of its authority and power, because how can you believe that this pope, who's God's vicar on earth, is the real pope when you have three of them, if not four? I believe there was at one time, and it just made society really uneasy, and really it was just unorganized. Um, and the loss of papal power and weakness showed during this time, and people started to lose faith, and their perspectives on the church began to change. The church lost a lot of support during this time. The next thing that I'm going to be talking about is the Black Death. The Black Death was one of the biggest pandemics, and one of the most significant things to happen during the medieval times. And it's kind of ironic that we have a pandemic going on ourselves right now, but it's not to this extent. But it's comparable in some ways. But the Black Death during this time happened because of these rats that came over from eastern parts of Europe, where these fleas that were infected with the plague attached themselves to these rats. And when all these ships came over to the western parts of Europe, they would kill the rats, and then they would attach themselves to humans. And this plague was so contagious and so deadly that essentially, if you were even closer in the same room as someone who had it, you were going to die. It was so bad that at one point, so many people were dying that there were just piles of bodies in the streets, because people were dying at such a fast rate that they couldn't bury all these people. And so many millions and millions of people were dying, and it was spreading so easily that people began to question their religion. They thought, how could God allow this to happen? God is supposed to be this almighty being who's supposed to protect us and keep us healthy, and we're good, faithful individuals, and we pray and do all these things. But so how is he going to let this happen to us? And during this time, a lot of bishops and a lot of priests were fleeing countries, and they were fleeing the churches, and they were scared of what was happening, and so they were leaving. And with this loss of faith, and seeing these authoritative figures and these religious figures fleeing, people began to question, how is the faith that I believe in and I'm praying to, how is it failing me like this? And so a lot of people, were questioning God and these figures, these religious figures in society, and how are they going to let this happen? And so this shifted a lot of people from believing in the church, and a lot of people lost their faith. So these 5 turning points, Gregory the Great in the 6th century, Charlemagne in the 9th century, the Crusades in the 11th century, the Avignon Papacy, and the Black Death in the later centuries, these all had huge, tremendous effects on society, and specifically the church. The church was an extremely influential part of medieval society, and all of these different events and these different aspects of these major events all led to either an increase in the church and its power, for example, like Gregory and Charlemagne, and really increasing its power and spreading Christianity throughout Europe, to then a huge decrease and a huge loss of faith and a huge distrust in the church when things like the plague happens, and huge effects that changed people's entire lives. Um, so these were the five main turning points in society during this time, and I hope you enjoyed.